you're assessing according to some standard. So what standard are you using?
I see. So I know this is a trick apologists like to often use. They say, well, you need God to
Wait,
be the standard, and if then you can't really call anything evil. So I have two initial responses to that. The first is,
can I jump in? Can I just very quickly jump in? Just want to make an observation, and then I'll let you say what your response. Okay, you know this is a trick that apologists use. Okay, I'm not offended by that. I'm just looking at the maneuver. Okay, what I've done is asked you a reasonable question about the nature of grounding. It is not a trick of apologists. It's a legitimate philosophical question.
all right, everybody, welcome to the second official edition of Atheist's Advocate. The first time around, we had Dr. Gary Habermas on to discuss the resurrection. Today, we have Greg Koukl on, and we're going to be debating the problem of evil. You can see I'm in my outfit, my character Maxwell Yates. I will go full on into character in just a little bit. But Greg, you said you wanted to make some, what was it? Make some kind of
Yeah,
preliminary
qualifying
remarks.
remarks, right. Yeah, first of all, nice to see you again, Stelman. I'm glad to be able to work again on this. We did this once before, not quite the same format, but we had a chat. And I wish I had some fancy cap like you have. You have your nice deerstalker there, like Sherlock. Am I Moriarty here? I don't know. What did Moriarty wear? Anyway, I've done these kinds of things in the past, and I've always enjoyed them. But I always make a qualifier when I do this, and sometimes I've done it with an individual on camera like yourself, role-playing the atheist. I've actually done it with atheists, real atheists, on my own show, and it was kind of simulcast, in that case, to that atheist's own crowd on his Facebook Live, which was interesting. And I do it with audiences too. So when I teach tactics, we'll sometimes have an interactive where I say, okay, we'll just take a half hour or so, and I'll entertain any questions that you want from the audience. The audience can be, in a sense, the secular hostile audience, and we'll just see how it goes. And that's the key. We'll just see how it goes. And that's the qualifier is that you never know how it's going to go. Okay. There are times when I may not know how to answer a question. I may not know how to maneuver and stuff. What I tell audiences is these kinds of engagements are not always tidy. And the engagements, like even the role plays, like this one, is not always tidy because life is not tidy in these kinds of things. And what I don't want any of your viewers to get the impression of is that I'm going to be right there with the snappy response and deal with every issue that you bring up to everyone's satisfaction, because that isn't the way it works in real life. And what's going to happen to a lot of your viewers is they're going to say, well, Koukl wrote the book. He knows how to do that. He's been doing this for a while, but I can't do that. And my response to those who are watching that might be tempted to think that is that the game plan that I teach about in the tactics book, and that will be a backdrop for my engagement with you. Maybe after we're done, we can discuss those details a little bit after we're done with our role play. But before the show is over, we can discuss those details. But the game plan is a game plan anyone can use to get rolling in a conversation. But as you do this more frequently, you're going to get, like anything else, more efficient at it. What I like about the game plan is that, generally speaking, the game plan provides a tremendous amount of safety for the novice Christian getting engaged in these conversations. Now, it's not going to provide a lot of safety for me in this conversation because you have your deerstalker hat on and you are loaded for bear. I know that. So there's a lot of things that are going to come my direction. And but generally in conversation, that isn't the way it goes. Generally in conversations, they start out either relaxed. They start out relaxed and non-directional. And it's the Christian who is beginning to employ the game plan that starts to gather some information and kind of get the lay of the land and figure out, well, what direction might be a good direction to go, but always using questions as much as possible. So that's my qualifier. Things could get messy. I may be totally bested by the man in the deerstalker cap, but one of the liabilities to having certain kinds of debates, whether public or individually, is sometimes the best idea doesn't always seem to win. And again, I'm not trying to cover for myself so much, but just to educate Christians about how these things go. That's why I don't debate that much in formal debates, because there's gamesmanship that is involved in persuasiveness, and there's rhetorical moves that are involved. And so a lot of that, a lot of times the person on the other side of the conversation is much better at some of those moves than the person with the true answers. And so the bad answers look better than they ought to because of these other elements. So anyway, this is all part of the way engaging others for Christ with the truth plays out in conversations. It's not tidy. We'll just see how it goes. And as Dennis Prager used to say when I did this radio show with him many, many years ago, may the best, well, this was religion on the line, so it was a Jew, a Protestant, a Roman Catholic, may the best religion win. But the idea here is may the best idea win, kind of deal.
Right. Yeah, and my goal with this is more like it's to steelman the atheist position, and it's try to present the audience with both sides of an issue and to try to give them a template of what kind of things they might encounter. So I'm trying to give the best ideas, but there might be some places where I try to take a sucker punch because I know I've encountered that plenty. And so, but
no worries.
But yeah, so the debate we're about to go into, everybody, is going to be on the problem of evil. So, I will be Maxwell Yates within a matter of seconds. Maxwell Yates. All right, about to go into character. It's a whole thing. All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Atheist's Advocate. I'm your host Maxwell Yates. Today we have a guest, Dr. Gregory Koukl, who had a lengthy resume that he demanded I go through. He holds 2 master's degrees. He's very proud about that. He's spoken on over 70 universities. He's hosted a radio show for 26 years. He's the founder and president of Stand to Reason, str.org. And he serves as the adjunct professor of Christian apologetics at Biola University. Dr. Gregory Koukl, thank you for being here, sir.
Well, thank you for the promotion. Actually, I don't have a doctorate, so and I do have the 2 masters. But generally, what I say to people, there must have been some misunderstanding here. I say less is more. You don't have to go through all of those kinds of things, so that's not required. We're just having a conversation about important matters.
So no doctorate, so G-Dog it is then. All right. So I could, if you would prefer, lay this out in premises. I could just give you my central argument, but instead we'll start here. What's your initial reaction is if somebody says to you, like I myself believe, that there's just so much evil in the world that how could we believe that there's a good God behind it?
Okay, so just so I'm clear a little bit, Matt, because we haven't met before. This is really our first time of conversation. I'm just making the presumption here, in light of your show, et cetera, that you're the atheist who is challenging me as a Christian theist, okay? What kind of atheist are you? Just so I know.
I would say I don't believe there's any good reason to believe there's a God. I like to kind of state it in the reverse, as if you tell me there's a God, I would say I don't believe you, and I would say I would need good reasons or good evidence to believe there's a God.
Sure.
And in the absence of someone presenting that, I think I am justified in saying there is no God.
Okay, I completely agree with that statement, by the way. If there's no good reasons to believe, then you're justifying in believing there is no God. But that was a point that I just wanted to get to for clarity. So your claim is that there is no God?
Yes.
Okay. Now, it's not just regarding the God issue, but in terms of a broader metaphysic, in other words, view of reality, would you consider yourself like a materialist? Do you know what the term means? I don't mean to be patronizing.
No,
just
true. Yeah, well, people have asked me if I'm a naturalist, and I'll say, well, yes, I am a naturalist, but then they'll ask me clarifying things like, well, do you believe then in morality or laws of logic? And I would say, well, yes, but I do believe those are part of nature, but I don't believe that everything that's part of nature or natural means it's made of molecules, means that it's made of material. So no, I don't think I would classify myself as a materialist in the strict sense.
A materialist. Okay, good. That's actually an interesting take, because most naturalism generally means a materialistic world governed by natural laws. That's generally what naturalism means. So you've expanded the idea of naturalism to include immaterial things like morality, I presume, certainly the laws of logic. You mentioned that, right?
Yes.
Okay, so fine. All right, so good. That gives me some understanding where you're coming from, and I appreciate the kind of the profile there. So back to the original question. The question was about evil in the world and the existence of God, as I recall. Is that right? Okay, so you do believe there is evil in the world. Okay, when you raise the question of evil, what exactly do you mean by evil? No, your definition is what I'm looking for. Okay, all right, go ahead. I'm sorry. Were you finished? All right, because I've this definition is really important for our conversation if I'm to answer your challenge. But the definition is confusing to me, because I asked you, what do you mean by evil? And you said counterproductive to human flourishing. And so my question is going to be then, what is evil about something being counterproductive to human flourishing? By the way, and I don't mean this in a cocky way, but whatever that means, human flourishing. So that's another big question mark. Maybe we'll come back to that. So when you say it's counterproductive to human flourishing, it sounds to me just simply like you're saying that it gets in the way of human flourishing, and whatever human flourishing is, that's a good thing, and to block the good thing, that's a bad thing. But all you've done now is kind of talked in a circle. So when you say that human flourishing is good and blocking human flourishing is bad, what do you mean by those terms? And what, maybe another way of putting it is, what is it that makes these things bad?
Sure. So that was perhaps a very sloppy definition. I would say grotesquely immoral would be a better definition, because obviously you can perceive of two parents who don't have children, and you could say, well, that's counterproductive to human flourishing, but it's certainly not evil. But as opposed to torturing people and killing them as to impede, say, that tribe's version of human flourishing, that would be evil. So perhaps a better definition would just to say not simply immoral, but grotesquely so.
Okay, let me just observe something here, Max. What you've done, I've asked you, is what do you mean by evil? And what you've done, understandably, is you've given me examples of things that you think are evil. My question is more pointed than that. Why are you using, say, these examples of grotesquely immoral things rather than, say, kindness or mercy or something like that as an example of evil? The point I'm getting at is you must have some standard that you're using to measure these actions by, in order for you to call some actions good and some actions evil. I'm not disputing whether these are good or evil. I'm asking about the nature of the claim you're making, the standard. So what standard are you using to judge whatever grotesque thing that you see? And the word grotesque is, I take, not just to be talking about your emotions, but they're talking about your moral assessment, okay? Notice I said moral assessment. You're assessing according to some standard. So what standard are you using?
I see. So I know this is a trick apologists like to often use. They say, well, you need God to be the standard, and then you can't really call anything evil. So I have two initial responses to that. The first is...
Right, can I jump in? Can I just very quickly jump in? Just want to make an observation, and then I'll let you say what your response. Okay, this is a trick that apologists use. Okay, I'm not offended by that. I'm just looking at the maneuver. Okay, what I've done is asked you a reasonable question about the nature of grounding. It is not a trick of apologists. It's a legitimate philosophical question. Okay, so for those listening, I'm just letting them know what's going on here. So go ahead.
Okay.
Your response.
So fair enough. So first, I would say I don't necessarily have all the answers. I am a more realist. I would say the answers to a lot of these questions.
Okay.
I admit I don't know. I do think it's possible that there could be some unknown natural law that we have not yet discovered that kind of grounds morality. There are many theories, atheistic theories, to ground morality. Now, without me necessarily appealing to any of those, you said before I was just giving you examples of evil. I would say. So I do think the definitions here get to a point where they're irreducible, where something by definition is evil. It's not merely an example. I think reality is such a way that, for example, torturing a child is just by definition evil. I don't have to give you any kind of underpinning for that. I think that just by definition. So for example, if I ask you what murder was, what's the definition of murder? People typically say, well, it's wrongful killing. Well, it's by definition wrongful killing. By definition, it's wrong. And I think that's the case with a lot of these things.
Okay, let's go back over some of the things you said. First, you said you were a moral realist. Real important point, by the way, and for people who are listening may not know the terminology here. What that means is that moral obligations are objective, that they're not mind-dependent. They actually exist outside. They are not simply our subjective preferences. Morals are not relative. They're absolute in some sense, or maybe objective is a better word. That's what moral realism means. So just so I understand you, that's what you mean by that. Is that correct?
Sure. I mean, I get a bit fuzzy when we start talking about beyond human opinion, but... We can go.
Well, that wasn't the language I used. That wasn't the language I used. I said mind independent. In other words, just to use another illustration, if I say grass is green, that statement is true if grass actually is green. Okay? Even if I don't believe it's green, it still is so if the statement is objectively true. So the truthfulness is in the object. It isn't in my opinion about the object. That's relativism. When it comes to morality, it's the same kind of thing. If we say rape is wrong, if we're realists, what we're saying is the action of rape has a quality about it of wrongness, immorality. Even if people think rape is a good thing, then they're mistaken about it. That's the difference between subjectivism and objectivism.
Sure.
Okay, so your objection to God based on evil requires evil being real, out there, not just inside here. And that's why I was glad that you said you're a moral realist, which means you're a moral objectivist. Okay. Then we went to the question of grounding, which is the question I asked. How is it that these things are so? And you said sometimes they're true by definition. And you used murder as an example. Killing is taking a life. Murder is taking a life without justification. Now, of course, murder is a legal term defined by people. All right? That's a different situation than saying that murder is wrong in the objective sense. I know you mentioned that there are a lot of ways that atheists have grounded morality, that is, tried to make sense of the objective nature of morality without God. I only know of one way, and I've had lots of discussions here, of grounding objective morality, now I'm choosing the words carefully, without God, and that is moral Platonism. Now that has its own problems, but I'm just addressing the throwaway. Well, there's lots of ways to do this, and as far as I know, there are not lots of ways of doing this. What you've just simply done is declared some things as wrong, quote unquote, by definition, okay? So all that to just clarify what you just said, and I understand you properly. That's not to respond yet. I do have a response. But did I get you right?
Sure. I do want to make one clarification, because when I say I'm a moral realist and you say I believe in, therefore, objective morality, I don't want to make the mistake of saying I'm a moral Platonist, because I don't believe that morality is something that just kind of exists out there in the ether.
Okay.
When I say objective or moral realist, I just mean regardless of human opinion. And I have my own way of grounding that.
That's exactly what that means. So we agree on that, fine. And moral Platonism is a way of trying to explain how objective morality exists without God. Now, all I'm saying is that's the only way I know that any atheist has ever come up with grounding it. And I've had lots of these discussions. Okay, in any event, the way you've tried to do it is just defining it. Okay, so I don't know where you live, but I imagine you have a street in front of your house, right?
Yeah.
Is there a speed limit there?
Yes.
Okay. If people break the speed limit, are they doing something wrong? In general parlance here, just general way of talking about it. Okay. The question is, excuse me, what makes that wrong? And it sounds to me like you've said to me, if you follow this example, you said, well, there's a speed limit sign outside of my house. Everybody can see it. It's obviously wrong because there it says 35 miles per hour. What I'm asking is a different question. The question I'm asking is, who put the speed limit sign there? Now, let's just say, for the sake of discussion, Max, I'm the one who put the speed limit sign there. I made the speed limit sign. I put it in front of your house. Is anybody obliged to go the speed that I say they should go?
I guess it would depend on whether or not you had particular reasons. Like, I mean...
Really?
Well,
okay, if I don't,
so
let's make my reason.
the obligation isn't to you. The obligation is the reason any speed limit sign is out there is to not endanger other people's lives.
Okay, so what you've done is you've just smuggled in a moral good to explain moral goods. Why is it wrong to endanger other people's lives? This is the point I'm getting to. This is the grounding question. And what you've said so far is it's just wrong by definition. And so I'm asking, whose definition? Who put the sign out there? Me? You? Somebody else? Maybe the sign didn't come from somebody. It just kind of looks like a sign that nature made, which you alluded to that a few moments ago. Maybe this is just a feature of nature. Well, if nature made it, and it looks like 35 miles an hour, but that's wind and rain and erosion, why am I obliged to obey it?
I don't suppose you would be necessarily.
Okay, well then that raises a question about the way you have grounded morality. I wouldn't be obliged to obey it, but that's the reasons that you have given me why the grotesque things that you described are actually wrong. Because they're just wrong by definition. The sign is just there. Well, I don't know if the sign is just there or nature made it, why I have any obligation to do that.
Okay, well, fair enough, but don't apologists often appeal to the kind of the moral law written on the hearts of people and our conscience is how we intuitively know right and wrong? Because that would seem that the apologist is agreeing that there's something universal among us. And I would say, yes, when you get down to the bottom, there's just something things we all intuitively know are wrong or evil by definition, and there is no irreducibility to it.
I agree entirely. That's a great observation, but I want you to listen to your words. Don't apologists point to the law written on our hearts that we intuitively know? I agree entirely. That's how we know. But I'm not asking a question about how you know. The answer to the question about the speed limit of how you know is you said, look at the sign. My question is, who put the sign there and what gives the sign authority? I agree that we have something inside of us that allows us to know right from wrong, by and large. The problem isn't epistemological. It's, to use another fancy word I'm sure you're familiar with, it's ontological. The grounding problem, as you properly put it earlier. Who put the sign there? Who put the laws there? Even if I feel inside that I have it written on my heart, that's just subjective.
Sure.
But you were saying that they're not subjective, they're objective. So what is the objective source of authority that makes the laws written on our house obligatory for us to obey?
Sure. So I want to be careful here. I didn't claim that, for example, that no laws or no things were irreducible. So the speed limit sign is a perfect example. We know those are man-made. We know there's discussions. We know they vary street to street. And so we can understand that there is an irreducibility, to example, for that. But I'm saying, regardless of how many things there were, it does get to a point where we do have to understand certain things are wrong by definition. And so when you reduce that, you have to say, well, why is it wrong to speed? Well, because you're going to endanger other people's lives. Or why is it more not to have a stop sign? Well, because you're going to endanger other people's lives. And I do think that's the point where you get to the irreducibility of it. Now you're asking me the grounding, and I would simply say I'm not positive. I do think it could be some unknown or undiscovered natural law that grounds these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were hinting at something earlier. You almost said it. I was waiting for you to finish the sentence, Max. And when I asked you about the speed limit sign, if I had put the speed limit sign there, you paused for a long time and you were reflecting on it. What would make it justified for me to demand that you obey the sign that I put there? And you said, well, it would depend on the reasons, which I think is a good response, but it needs to go further. What kind of reasons would be appropriate that would make my claim on you legitimate to obey the speed limit? And the answer, I think, is going to be something like, you would have to be a proper authority. This is what this is all getting down to. All you're saying is things are wrong by definition, but that's not really an answer, Max, because people can redefine all of those moral things, and they have in history. Hitler had his definition. ISIS has his definition.
Yes.
American slaveholders had their definitions. And so slavery was not wrong by definition. Sure. It was right by definition on their view. So that just reduces morality to subjectivism, which it sounded like you said you rejected.
Sure.
Is that right?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say you have to be a proper authority. I would say your reasoning has to be sound. So, for example, let's say the reason you put the speed limit sign in place is because you had a loved one who died in a car accident on that street, and it was because someone was speeding. That right. Wouldn't be a good reason to put a speed limit sign, and the reason is because it's, at least hypothetically, we could evaluate the evidence and we could say, well, on average, this high speed limit is safer. There was just an exception in the case of your loved one. So right. your evidence, your reasoning for having to put that speed limit sign there would have to be a broader claim that on average people who go this high speed are unsafer than people who go a lower speed. And so sure,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say this is why I started off, and perhaps the definition was sloppy, of human flourishing. The reason I used that was because I do believe that these morals are grounded in the biological process of evolution. And so so what Hitler did was wrong in an objective sense, because it was counterproductive to the overall human flourishing. It may have been good for his tribe, but as far as the universal approach to human flourishing, it was immoral. And there are certain things that are objectively good for the process of evolution, and things that are objectively bad.
Okay, couple of thoughts here, and one of them is the speed limit sign is a metaphor, or it's an illustration to get to the question of in what sense do we have a genuine obligation to obey some law. So if we take that and broaden it to these other kinds of things, it's kind of to miss the point of the illustration. But even so, let me just follow the direction you went, because you then went from speeding under most circumstances isn't going to be a problem, but you lost a child or a loved one under that circumstance. Most of the time, this speed limit doesn't endanger human flourishing, so breaking the speed or having a different speed limit would be okay. But what you've done is you've smuggled in something, Max. You've smuggled in the goodness of human flourishing into the discussion, and you're saying really the grounding of everything is human flourishing. That's what makes rules obligatory. Well, I'm with you on that. I think there's a lot of sense to that. But notice you're claiming that human flourishing is a superior good that governs the other behaviors, and I'm asking the same question. Why is human flourishing good in the objective moral sense? And here's the answer you gave: Darwinian evolution.
Or
you just changed all your
natural law.
Oh, okay, that's right.
What I was saying,
or a natural law. Okay, I got you.
Because I'm not claiming to have the full answer. I was merely bringing up evolution because it is an objective reality we can point to. That any old type of behavior would be good for human flourishing.
Okay, there's all kind of questions that come to mind right here. But if Darwinian evolution is responsible for our convictions about morality, is the moral principle or moral rule inside the human being, or is it outside in the world? In other words, how is it that Darwinian evolution makes murder wrong in itself? Or maybe murder is not a good option because the definition may be ambiguous. How about Darwinian makes cruelty, that's a better one, cruelty wrong in itself? How is it that a process of Darwinian evolution could, that's one of the things you put on the table, could make cruelty wrong in itself?
Well, let me ask you, do you want to live in a society where people treat each other cruelly?
But that's not the question we're asking, what I like and what I don't like. I'm asking the question about how
fair enough.
It's irrelevant. If I wanted to live in
but I'm not asking my opinion. Obviously, it would be objectively unbeneficial to you to live in a society that was cruel to people. That society would not flourish.
Okay,
that's
well,
not just a matter of opinion.
Well, it all depends on what you mean by the term flourishing. And this is something I brought up earlier that we did pursue. You have in your mind some ideal form of human living that you call flourishing, and you think morality is tied to this particular thing. So let's just take it out of the formal category and make it more material. What exactly is human flourishing? And I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase here. Lots of people have very different views about what that amounts to, which is why there are different moral points of view about things. You might say human flourishing is freedom. Hitler said human flourishing is the Aryan race succeeding over the other races that are enslaved. That's flourishing for the Third Reich. You laugh because it sounds ridiculous, and it does sound ridiculous, but how do you escape the problem?
Because by definition, it's not human flourishing. If he's saying only this particular type of human, well, he's adding a qualifier to that. So human flourishing would mean all humans flourishing.
Well, that is the way you're defining human flourishing. What Hitler would say is that real humans are the Aryan race, and all the other technically biological humans are actually subhuman when it comes to the requirement of flourishing. So, what is the external standard by which you are judging Hitler's assessment of human flourishing as inappropriate and yours as more appropriate? That's what we're getting down to.
Well, so I don't want to spend too much longer on this, but I would say not that wouldn't be a proper word, but the progression of human reason. Obviously, the longer we've lived and we've I mean, you would agree, it's as we've progressed in our reason, reason gave us the enlightenment. Reason and the Enlightenment helped us abolish slavery, helped us realize the Nazis were wrong. So as we progress, as evolution continues further, we realize certain things are immoral, and our definitions get better.
Okay, all you've done is skirted the whole issue here. Tell me about the laws of reason. I know you know a lot about the way reasoning works. You're a smart guy. You've studied this. You're using reasoning as we're talking. Tell me about how the laws of reason inform anything about morality. So A equals A, law of identity, the law of excluded middle, the law of non-contradiction. These are all laws of reason. What about reason tells us anything about what is right and what is wrong?
Okay, so are you claiming, so are you setting up a dichotomy here where I believe reason informs us on morality and you don't believe reason informs us on morality?
I'm saying reason is a category of thinking, yes, and morality is a separate category of thinking, and the two are not the same. Many reasonable, rational people do very evil things.
Sure.
And they do evil things for reasons that suit them and that follow from their own presumptions about the world. Okay?
See, I would say they're wrong. If Hitler thinks it's going to suit him to kill everybody else, well, obviously, his reasons for committing those atrocities, he thought he was promoting his own race, but what he in fact did was turn the United States, other people with good reasons to believe he was wrong, he turned them against him, and so he was his own demise there.
Well, so if you're just looking about cause and effect there, the reason that Hitler lost was because he attacked the Russians in Operation Barbarossa and declared war on the United States when Japan hit Pearl Harbor. That was stupid. But it had nothing to do with his morality because his whole moral viewpoint didn't lose him the war. It accomplished his goal almost completely with regards to the Jews. And that's why almost all the Jews in Europe were destroyed, okay? What you're doing is confusing different categories of things. What you're saying is it didn't turn out well for Hitler in the long run because he lost the war. That doesn't tell us anything about his concept of human flourishing that is opposed to yours.
It does, because my concept of human flourishing is I don't think anybody would disagree that all humans should flourish and all humans should be equal and all humans should have freedom and rights to choose.
Okay, well, that's actually the statement that you just made is quite controversial. You said all should flourish, and then you gave it content. Everybody should have a right to choose and have freedom and those kinds of things. Those are Western values, okay, largely dictated by a biblical worldview. They are not universal world values.
They were largely dictated by the Enlightenment.
Okay, the point. Okay, well, then I withdraw the comment because the source of them is not important. The important thing is that these things are things that are part of your idea of flourishing, but you have not established that they are universally obligatory because there's no external standard that you could appeal to say that my sense of flourishing, though everybody in my group and my friends agrees with it, is really the objective morality.
Well, by definition, it is.
Well, by your definition, not by Hitler's definition.
Okay, but so I would like to change here because we
could, a whole bunch of people that are living a very self-consumed life, by their definition too, not yours, but theirs. They have a different definition of human flourishing.
Sure. So so I do want to move on because we've been 30 minutes discussing this, and I will admit it was a fault on mine. I started out with saying evil in some way disproves God, and that allowed you. And I know you got offended when I called it a trick apologist play, but it has allowed you to go 30 minutes and not answer the question of how good God could allow evil.
Yeah,
so
I wasn't offended by it. I was just pointing out that it was a little maneuver that wasn't really to the point.
Okay, but it has allowed you to continue for 30 minutes and not answer the question, which was my thought fault. I started out with saying gratuitous evil. All I have to do is switch and say gratuitous suffering. All I have to do is grant moral subjectivity and say a world with this much excessive and unnecessary suffering gives us reason to not believe that there is a good God behind it.
Fair enough, but the reason that we spent this time is I'm going to the coherence of the question. I'm not afraid of answering the question itself. I'm just trying to make sure that the question is coherent coming from an atheist. Now, what you've done is you've just substituted the word suffering for evil with the implication that gratuitous suffering is evil. So you've smuggled in a moral concept into the notion of suffering.
But you're right. I have, but so it's not as though, on my worldview, I don't believe let's say I was a moral subjectivist, right? Because in your view, I would have to be if I was an atheist. So in my worldview, suffering isn't objectively evil. But if we transfer the same amount of suffering onto your worldview, in which there's a God, it would have to be evil. And so I'm making an internal critique of your worldview that there could be so much unnecessary suffering and a good God behind it.
Yeah, that's a much more tidy way for you to make the objection at this point. And here's my response. If the challenge is that on your worldview there is an internal objection, then my question is specifically, what is the internal objection?
Would you like me to phrase it in terms of premises?
Sure.
Okay, so
if you want to, you can do it any way you want. I just want to know specifically what is the objection.
Okay, well, so I have two objections that we can kind of put together. One is a more generic objection to theism in general, which would say, premise one, if God exists, and of course we mean a God who is good by definition and all-powerful, if God exists, he would not allow excessive unnecessary suffering. Premise two, but there is excessive unnecessary suffering. Three, therefore, God does not exist.
Okay. All right, let me ask you about the second premise, because I think that the first one is pretty uncontroversial. You say there is excessive and unnecessary suffering. Define excessive for me, because this is one of your premises.
Right. Well,
and unnecessary. That would be. Those are actually like synonyms. Excessive would probably mean to you unnecessary. Is that fair?
Well, the reason I put excessive is because to just say unnecessary by itself, the theist can always fall back on, oh, well, maybe there's a reason we just don't know about. And I would say, well, even if God does have reasons for allowing suffering, the sheer amount of it, the excessiveness of it, certainly outweighs him having any reasons. So that's why I added excessive.
All right. Okay, so that's why I'm asking you, how tell me what you know about the world that allows you to assess what you think is excessive and unnecessary suffering in the world.
Well, sure.
You know, okay,
turn on the news.
Therefore, what?
Turn on the news.
Turn
Look
on
at all
the
the
news.
mass shootings. Look at all the gross violations of human rights that take place all over the world. Look at the amount of children who have pediatric cancer, and there has to be fundraisers for it.
Okay, when you say violations of human rights, you must be meaning not real violations of human rights, because you're now doing an internal critique of Christianity. You must be meaning what I think are violations of human rights.
Sure.
Let's go back to your more careful characterization of your challenge. Okay. Well, I certainly see all of those things here, but you're not claiming that bad things, evil things happening. You're saying that these are unnecessary and they're excessive. So I'm asking you, how do you know these are unnecessary and excessive? That's what I'm asking, and that's required for your argument to work.
So, okay, and I should have perhaps looked up this stat ahead of time, but let's just say we had the stat in front of us. How many kids die of cancer every year? I don't know. Let's pick a number. What would be a reasonable number to pick?
Well, I don't know. Any number, no matter what number you pick, it wouldn't be enough to make your point, because your point isn't that things happen that are bad. Your point is that it's unnecessary and excessive.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, how is it that you assess that all of these things, given your take on the world, that all of these things are unnecessary and excessive?
Sure. So the reason I brought up the numbers, let's just say it was 1 million. I don't know. Now, my central argument would be, because typically the response is, well, God has some unknown reasons for allowing evil things to happen. My central argument would be, I don't care what God's purpose behind the universe is. Even one child dying of cancer is too much. He's unjustified in even letting one child suffer. It means
I'm glad you said that.
And
I'm glad you said that, Max, because this is why the number. This is why the number doesn't matter. Even if you say 10 million or even 1, that's going to be too much for you. Okay, just for clarification.
No, fair enough. The reason I brought up the number, though, is because, like, let's just say it was 10 million. Assuming God is all-powerful, it's like, well, could he accomplish the same goal with one less of those 10 million? 9 million and however many nines would follow. Could he accomplish the goal with that? How about 2 less? How about 3 less? And then so you would get back to 1. I think 1 is too much.
But you see, what you've done, though, Max, is you've jumped into our worldview and you're making assessments that you are not in a position to make. First, you ask me, how could there be a God when there's so much excessive suffering? And then you say, I know your move. You're going to say God has reasons for that. I'm not making that move at this point. I'm simply making this move. You have claimed that inside my worldview, there is a commitment to excessive suffering. And so now it becomes, since it's your syllogism and your argument, it is your responsibility to demonstrate the truthfulness of that premise. It's not enough for you to say, boy, I really don't like those things, and look at all the bad things that happen to people. What you have said is they're excessive within the context of a Christian worldview, which creates the contradiction for Christians. You haven't shown me that it's excessive. You stepped outside of the worldview and you said, to me, not even a single cancer would be defensible from God's perspective. Okay, I can see that from you, but that's not the nature of your challenge. Your challenge is there's an internal contradiction of Christianity, and you have not demonstrated that. You just said there's more suffering than you like, or that you know good reason for, but that's not enough to create an argument that goes through against Christianity.
Well, I'm not merely claiming that God couldn't have good reasons for allowing suffering, like, because we're not just talking about someone, I don't know, having a hard childhood and then they grow up and they're rich and they say, well, it's a good thing I struggled as a child. We're talking about gratuitous things like pediatric cancer, for example. What about?
But to call it gratuitous is circular. This is the whole point. Is it gratuitous or not? And you can't answer the question for me to show me it is gratuitous. You're just simply assuming that it's gratuitous. That is, it's unnecessary. It's beyond the pale. God didn't need to do this.
Sure. Well, I would say by any human who has any moral standards whatsoever would save a child if they had the power to, and God doesn't do that. So at this point, the burden of proof would have to be on you to show God has some reason to allow this.
No, it isn't, because I'm not making that claim. You're making the claim God has no reason to allow this. The only claim that I would make, which I hadn't made yet, is that he could have. And that certainly is plausible, which is why this particular argument is not advanced very often by any philosophical atheist, because they know that the argument itself is not a sound argument. They can't defend the premises that they're advancing against the Christian theist. So my position just simply is, I don't know the reason why there's so much evil in the world, but my worldview can make sense of the evil, for one, and there's enough things that I've seen in the world that show me that, yeah, sometimes what appears in the moment to be gratuitous evil or gratuitous suffering, let's put it that way, turns out not to be gratuitous at all. It is not the case, by the way, Selman, Max. It's not the case, Max. It's that if you could save a child in any circumstance, you would, because sometimes saving one child would mean the cost of the lives of other people in the particular moral equation you're looking at. Moral equations are complex, and we don't always know the consequences of the behaviors of individual people. I've just asked you to give the argument. You gave the argument with premises that you can't defend. You just said they're obviously true. And it's...
Well, hold on here. So you want to paint a circumstance where, okay, maybe there's an instance in which we wouldn't save a child if it meant, say, costing the lives of 10 more children. And so it would be whatever more...
Well, those things happen all the time.
But okay, fair enough. But the problem with trying to make the way humans would or wouldn't intervene in a situation analogous to God is because human beings are limited. We're limited in power. So you can understand why we would be faced with a tough decision to let one die or let 10 die. Right. God is all powerful, right. So he can save all of them.
Right. That's right. And he's all knowing. And that means he knows the consequences of all the things would take place. Okay? And so that's why it might be he knows more. It might be, I'm not saying he does at this point. I'm just saying it certainly is plausible that God could know more about this than we do, and that he has a morally sufficient reason for allowing the evil in the world. Okay, it might be the case. And as long as it might be the case, then that argument doesn't go through.
But so here we come to it. What is his morally sufficient reason for allowing pediatric cancer?
Well, I don't have the mind of God, so I can't offer that. All right. But see, the thing is that a person in your situation is kind of at a crossroads. You're actually jumping back and forth between two different roles. You're jumping into the Christian worldview and you're saying, look, regardless of what I think about whether there's evil, you think there's evil in your worldview, but there is gratuitous suffering, and so therefore your God must not exist. And I'm saying, well, if you're going to get into our worldview and assess it from the inside, it isn't our view that there is gratuitous suffering. God could possibly and does have a reason for these things. So there's not a contradiction in our worldview. But then you jump back into your worldview and you say, well, as an atheist, I think there's gratuitous suffering and that's evil. And my response is going to be, as an atheist, you can't make sense of evil to begin with.
So hold on, so a couple of things there. So for example, I wouldn't say as an atheist, I would just say as a reasonable moral person, I can make these judgments. Now, second of all, I'm not actually a moral relativist. I granted that for the sake of argument because it didn't seem we were going to get off the conversation. I am a moral realist, and look, most philosophers are moral realists, and most philosophers are atheists, and they have plenty of theories which to ground these things. So it's not the case that I have to be a theist to say there's gratuitous suffering. Now, you can say, well, if you start from the premise that God exists, then there would have to be a reason for everything. That's why I'm pointing out the contradiction, though. Because if there isn't a reason for everything, but God exists, well, you can't actually have both of those things in the same worldview. It is an internal...
But you haven't shown that... Max, you haven't shown that there isn't a reason for it. You just said you don't know the reason. Well, and it doesn't seem to you there's a good reason. You haven't shown there's no reason for it. That's the first thing.
So I would like to state that argument in the reverse then. Because I would say any justifying answer you give for God allowing suffering, I would say doesn't work. And so therefore, if there is no positive reason to believe God has a justifying reason for allowing suffering, then I'm justified in believing that he doesn't have a reason.
Yeah. Well, I think there is a positive reason for believing that, but it goes into a lot more details of the Christian worldview. The thing that we're facing here with you...
We could turn it into the Christian worldview.
Pardon me?
We could progress into the Christian worldview, because then it gets even worse than just theism.
So, no. What's curious about the way you're objecting is you haven't just said that that there is gratuitous suffering in the world. What you really amounted to saying is any kind of suffering, even one child with cancer, is unjustifiable. And anybody would save a child if he could save a child. I made the point, no, sometimes they wouldn't save a child. That has nothing to do with omnipotence. It has to do with reasons why you would do one thing rather than another. If you're going to maximize the goodness, sometimes you do sacrifice. And that, in principle, is available to the Christian with regards to God. And we've actually seen examples of that in personal life. You know, it's interesting. There's a great little line in a movie that is otherwise not particularly profound. It's called, and this is just to exemplify or to give an illustration of the point that I'm making. It's called... it's that Jim Carrey movie where he gets to be God for a day. What is that called? Bruce Almighty, yeah. So do you remember the scene where he gets mail, and these are all these prayer requests, and he answers all the requests yes. And what ends up taking place is he learns that by saying yes to everybody's request, a whole bunch of greater evil eventually befalls them. Now, I think there's insight in this. Surprisingly, from a movie like that, there is insight. It shows that sometimes what appears in the moment to be the good thing to do, for someone who's omniscient and sees the long-term consequence, it isn't the best thing to do. And by preventing that thing in that moment, there's a greater good that results.
Okay, so there's a plethora of things there. I won't be able to remember all of them. But where did it start off? Oh, you said that my position was any amount of suffering is too much. That's not the case. I'm not talking about things like like I could stub my toe, and you could say in a sense that I suffer. I'm not saying that God wouldn't allow that. I'm saying there does get to a point, pediatric cancer, and some children...
You said one occasion of pediatric cancer. Okay,
I'm saying one occasion of it gets to, the suffering gets to a level. It's not just stubbing toes or, I don't know, walking into a door or embarrassment. Mm-hmm. But actual suffering. When getting into, again,
embarrassment can be suffering, believe me.
Yes.
I've been there.
Yes. But even, and again, your example of a human who would allow a child to die because of reasons, again, the human is limited, God is not. So whatever God's reasons are, if God is all-powerful, he can accomplish those same reasons, he can accomplish the same goal, and not let children die of cancer.
Well, that's a presumption about the circumstances that you can't make, because you don't know the circumstances or the goods that are in play here. One of the greatest goods is the ability of human beings to. You mentioned earlier about liberty and freedom, and you used it as an example of a moral good. Okay, a lot of people exercise their liberty and freedom in a way that hurts other people. Okay, so here's a good thing being used to a bad end. But is liberty and freedom a good thing? That's the question.
Obviously.
I presume it is, because that's why you mentioned it's obviously right. So human beings are made by God with liberty and freedom. So if you want God to stop all the suffering that is frequently the result of other people's exercise of liberty and freedom, then that means you will be happy with him stopping you from exercising your liberty and freedom in ways that bring harm to other people. And harm goes beyond just a feeling of suffering and cancer. Harm is a very extensive concept that includes a lot of moral notions that you might not even agree with.
Okay, so we've gotten away from the idea that God might actually have a reason for allowing suffering. We're still waiting to hear a good reason why God would allow suffering. And now we've gotten into the free will defense. Here's why the free will defense doesn't work. Because...
Wait, can I clarify something first, Max? You said you've gotten away. I didn't get away. What I did is I gave you an example of a reason that God might be justified in allowing some evil in the world because there's a greater good, and that greater good is human freedom. And you acknowledge that it's a greater good.
A great good.
A great
certainly
good.
not great enough to allow children to suffer and be killed and be tortured. It's not that great.
Well, that would be your value system, right?
Because
Your
guess what?
sense of
That
human.
child doesn't have a choice. That child doesn't have any freedom in the matter.
Hmm.
But anyway, to this free will defense, and this side is where we start getting into the Bible, is the free will defense doesn't work for a multitude of reasons. God violates people's free will all the time. He violated all the Egyptians' free will. Pharaoh didn't want to let Moses go, yet he brought plague upon plague upon plague to violate his free will. Job, in the book of Job, didn't consent to all the suffering that befell him. So God does do this all the time. He does violate people's free will all the time.
Max, I don't dispute that, okay? But that actually kind of misses the point. The irony of your objection there about God violating free will, and those are just examples of God intervening and bringing judgment in many cases on evil that's being done, is that on the one hand, you're asking, why doesn't God do something about evil? And on the other hand, you're complaining that when God intervenes, that he's violating free will. And if free will is so sacrosanct, he would be violating it.
No, I wasn't complaining that he was doing it. I was just merely pointing out that you said the reason he might allow some suffering is because he has to allow free will, and I'm just pointing out that he violates free will all the time.
That's right, he does. But when he deems it morally appropriate to do so, but making human beings the kind of creatures that have moral freedom, that itself is a great good, is the point I'm making. Not that it's an inviolable principle. I'm not making that claim, so therefore I'm not vulnerable to that objection that you've just raised. I'm just simply saying that this is a great good. Now notice, just to be clear, Max, the way I'm arguing, I'm not saying here are all the reasons why God is justified in allowing what you think is gratuitous evil. What I'm doing is I'm going to the validity or the legitimacy of your second premise, because it's your argument that you raised, and that is that there is gratuitous suffering in the world. And what I'm pointing out is there are a variety of ways of demonstrating that there could be answers to the charge that there's gratuitous suffering. Unless you demonstrate, as a matter of fact, that all the suffering that you're looking at in the world that you're concerned about has no good reason in God's mind, then your argument against God does not go through. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, well, so, I mean, at that point, we would be appealing to an argument from ignorance. Because, I mean, simply put, let's just put the two worldviews on par with one another. On my worldview, I won't say the crude version of this, but stuff happens, right? There is no supernatural being behind it. Nature can be hectic. People can do evil things. It happens. It happens all the time. And so and I can only control what I do. I can't control what other people do. On your worldview, we would suspect that either there would be much less suffering, or, in your words, that God would have some overall good to allow from that. And I'm saying, of all the arguments I've heard from theists of types of good or types of goals or reasons God might have for allowing suffering, none of them are compelling, and certainly not compelling enough to allow the sheer amount of suffering that we see. Okay. That's why I say it's excessive.
Okay, I'm not arguing from ignorance here. What I'm arguing is that you gave a straight-ahead argument with premises, and you have not demonstrated the truthfulness of your premise that there is gratuitous suffering. And my saying there might be an answer is not an argument for ignorance. You have to demonstrate there is an answer for that. There is that you know that there is no good reason for that. What I've done is given examples of the kind of thing.
I'd like to state that in reverse and just say that I've never seen a compelling reason to believe God has a good reason.
Okay.
Kind of like my atheism. I don't claim that there is no God. I would say there's no reason to believe there's a God.
Well, then you could say that you don't have a compelling reason to believe in God because of gratuitous evil. That isn't your argument. Your argument was that there is no God because there is a gratuitous evil. That's a very different kind of thing. If you go back to your original syllogism, you are arguing against the existence of God based on gratuitous evil. To say that you're not convinced is a very different kind of thing. All I've been trying to stay on is your specific argument, Max, and trying to show that your argument does not go through, because you cannot substantiate the premises of your argument. As a theist, I don't have to answer all these things, because within my worldview, there is no contradiction.
Isn't that convenient?
It is convenient.
Sure.
It is convenient. I agree with that, but it's not illicitly convenient. You made a challenge about what goes on within my worldview. You were explicit in that regard, tidying up your challenge to say, okay, forget about me. Let's just go into your worldview. Well, if you're going to go inside of my worldview to show that there's a contradiction, then you're going to have to show there's actually a contradiction within our worldview, which you haven't done. What you've done is, as said, is as an outsider, I don't see any good reasons.
Okay,
so you've got to be either inside or the outside, one of the two.
Well, before we come to an end here, because we are running low on time, I do want to bring up a few quick points. So first of all, that was more of my internal critique of theism. My internal critique of Christianity would go even further, because the Bible teaches God loves everybody, right? God loves children. Yet there are several passages.
Max, let me ask you a question. You say we're about to close up here, and then you are introducing a whole bunch of new issues. So it feels like you're setting up a hit and run here. If you want to do that, you're welcome to. We don't have time for me to respond to them. It might be hours before I could answer all those things. So you have to make a choice. Do you want to go ahead and punch out with all these other points of objections to Christianity and said, nice conversation, Greg, we'll see you later?
Fair enough. So how about we do a part 2? Specifically on Christianity.
Well, let's just
that would be a sucker punch.
Leave that as an open possibility.
Fair enough. All right. So, any last points on this, Dr. Gregory Koukl?
Just that I'm not a doctor, but a master twice. No, I think that I've made my points fairly clearly. But, Max, I appreciate you engaging me on this, and I think you've been really polite and very thoughtful in your process. And you have a great accent. I don't know where it's from, but...
there we go.
There you go. Okay, now what character are you now?
I'm just
are you a jock? All right. I was very impressed with the accent, though, that you were able to maintain that in character for so long.
It was inspired by Christopher Hitchens.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay,
all right.
So we went longer than we planned to, and that's so I'll tell you what my strategy was deliberate. It was to start off with kind of how it went, but take shorter time. I was going to start off with, okay, there's gratuitous evil, and then I was expecting the challenge of, well, how do you justify evil, and then go further to morality on atheism. And so it was my strategy to very quickly pivot to, okay, fine, well, suffering, and we ended up spending a long time on evil, which is why a lot of my answers weren't prepared there. I wasn't prepared to give kind of an atheistic.
Well, I actually, from where I sat, I thought you did pretty well, better than most, honestly. But in my situation, notice that the way I started out is I started asking information questions. I kind of want to get at the lay of the land. So seems like you're an atheist. Well, what kind of atheist are you? Are you an atheist who says, I have no belief in God, or I believe there is no God? You seem to be the second, not the first, which I was glad to hear that, because I think that's what has more integrity intellectually. And then you raised the question, and I wanted to make sure, whether are you a materialist or a non-materialist or something like that, and you gave a fairly unique answer that you were you think certain non-material things are part of the natural universe, and that's actually a project that Thomas Nagel is pursuing at New York University, an atheist, because he thinks that physicalism, naturalism, is not adequate to explain the way the world actually is. So it was an interesting maneuver, and it kind of saved you some trouble. But now that I got that idea, then I was going basically to the coherence of the charge of evil against God coming from an atheist. And that's almost what, a half hour we talked about that, to the point where you were getting a bit frustrated. And maybe listeners were too, because you kept kind of going at the same information from a lot of different angles. And what I saw in your portrayal there, Stellman, as Max, was the same thing I see with atheists all the time. And Sam Harris famously with the human flourishing kind of rejoinder, and that is that they end up smuggling morality into their explanation of morality. I think that, there was a lot of stuff flying around there, and the speed limit signs and all of that kind of stuff, and maybe some people got lost in the details. But and that's what I mentioned a little earlier, that sometimes this whole process is not really tidy. But the broad point was, where all of these kinds of assessments are based implicitly on an objective standard.
Yeah.
And that's how the assessments are being made. But the atheist has no objective standard. And the best you did, which was not bad actually, well, maybe there's some kind of hidden natural law. Because it's true by definition isn't going to work, because all you have to do is change the definition and there's no longer something contrary to that is true. But it sounds compelling. Well, I think when people say it's true by definition, they say it is obviously wrong. But that's simply appeal to the sign being there on the street. I can see it, you can see it, everybody can see it. There it says 35 miles per hour. That wasn't my question. That's the epistemological question. How do we know it? And you made reference to this law written on the hearts. The real question is, how did the sign get there, and what gives the sign authority? What creates an obligation inside of us, regarding us, to obey what the sign says? That's the grounding concern. I was quite impressed that as an atheist, you even knew the right terminology, but you kind of seemed to jump away from that at different points to kind of escape the force, it seemed to me, of the charge.
Yeah, so
concern.
I have been working for a while on this, is not necessarily the atheist character, but trying to build a coherent worldview within atheism. And I've been trying to work with that. Okay, if I were an atheist, knowing all the things I know as an apologist, right, knowing the typical atheist lines don't work,
right,
how would I actually try to build a coherent worldview on atheism? And it used to be that when it came to morality, I was just going to say, yeah, it is just relative. That was the case. And then I accidentally caught myself saying I'm a moral realist, and that's because I've been kind of playing with this new idea of maybe you can ground it in evolution. But like I said, I had prepared my arguments more on suffering and not on evil, and so I got caught there, and I wasn't really able to.
Yeah, well, what you can't do is be a moral realist and ground morality in evolution. And the reason is because all evolution can do is, if it can do this, which I'm not convinced at all it can do this, but all it can do is produce beliefs inside of us that we call moral beliefs that enables us to get our genes more effectively into the next generation. It cannot make any act that looks like cruelty bad in itself. In fact, most of the time you look in the natural world, you see all kinds of things that look pretty cruel. I buried a rabbit in the backyard yesterday that had his head severed by one of my cats. All right, that was no fun for the rabbit. The cat had a good time. So the natural world has all kinds of things that are cruelty. How is it that evolution in one species then creates a conviction that cruelty is wrong? Oh, well, maybe it helps us to get our genes in the next generation, but it doesn't make the action wrong. It just convinces us in our minds it's wrong, which is just another type of relativism. That makes sense?
Yeah.
The evolutionary answer is always...
I mean, let's just say it's an objective fact, and let's say it's not even a moral objective fact, but it's just an objective fact that societies that don't consist of people who are constantly cruel to each other are just going to do better. Ones that don't have that. And that's an objective fact.
There's the smuggle. Wait, there's the smuggle. Do better. Better according to what standard? And see, this is something that, and all you've done is substituted a synonym, okay? Flourishing means doing better. So that's a tautology. You haven't explained anything. And I just want to explain to your audience, this is a maneuver that is made all the time. And frankly, I think it's unconscious by atheists, that they smuggle in these morally laden terms in order to explain morality. Well, of course, Sam Harris says, morality is about human flourishing. Obviously, okay, how do we flourish then? Well, science can give us objective standards by how we can flourish, and that's how he gets the so-called objective morality. But he has smuggled in moral content to the concept of flourishing. He's also smuggled in something else, and that is teleology. That is, human beings were meant for being operating at an optimal level.
Yeah.
So the optimal level is goodness. That's a moral notion smuggled in, and meant for the optimal level is a teleological notion that's smuggled in, that something intended human beings to be the best they could be. But of course, Darwinian evolution is a materialistic process. It has no end of any kind in view. It's just things happening. And so those are two examples of the atheist, and you displayed this in the conversation, trading on something that is at home in the Christian worldview but has no place in the atheistic worldview.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Sam Harris, one thing he does is, if you listen to him talking about building like a theory of morality from the ground up, anytime he uses the word morality, like pause it and see how he's using it, because he equates between subjective morality and objective morality, which is why I don't even necessarily like those terms. I think if there is morality, then by definition it's objective, and if there isn't, then you're just left with the descriptions of how beings behave and how we evolve to.
Yeah, Stillman, the problem with that way of looking at it, and I think that does tidy things up a bit. The problem is that definitions are conventional. They have to do with the way people use them. And now people use the word morality to describe objective morality and subjective morality. So we have to have a means to distinguish between them, so there is not the equivocation you were just complaining about a few moments ago, where you hop back and forth between these definitions like Sam Harris does without making it clear. You're jumping back and forth between these different things, which, by the way, is something else I think I was on the mark in identifying you doing in your challenge using the what's called the inductive problem of evil argument against Christianity. There's too much suffering. There's gratuitous suffering. For one, you're trying to protect yourself by jumping into my worldview, and he says, on your worldview, there is a contradiction. When then I showed that on our worldview there is not a contradiction, you haven't shown there's a contradiction within our worldview. What you do is you say, well, from where I sit, it looks like too much. But now you're back in the atheistic worldview, and you can't. To be fair, you've got to sit in one side or the other when you're making this kind of assessment. It's a little bit more of an esoteric point, and maybe some people didn't follow that. But I was particularly taken with your claim that maybe there's some natural law that we haven't discovered that grounds morality, and I thought it was a clever rejoinder, and I'd actually never heard it before, and that's why I paused and I'm thinking about it. Now, I think there's a real problem there, and that is kind of like a natural law of the gaps type thing. We know how morality works. In our common experience, morality entails obligation, and obligations are held between persons. And laws are made by lawmakers, and the law is only legitimate if the lawmaker has appropriate authority, those kinds of things. So any appeal to a natural law is not going to satisfy any of those features of morality that we know are part of morality as we observe the moral project. But it was clever, and it saved your program for a little while. I didn't actually raise the objection to that particular point, but I think that might come up. Somebody else might, it's an undiscovered, natural law. For all of those atheists who complain about the God of the gaps maneuver, or what they call the God of the gaps, this is the same problem in reverse.
Yeah, it was funny. I encountered that because I was debating an atheist, and so that's how I encountered it. He was saying perhaps morality is some unknown natural law, and kind of my response to it was, okay, so we don't know it yet. We haven't discovered it yet, right? And he was saying, yeah. And I was saying, well, how do we know then that when we discover it, it won't be a bunch of things contrary to what we think are right? Like we discover the natural law, and it turns out, we thought loving children was right, but according to this natural law, that's not the case. And his kind of appeal was to say, well, that's just so unlikely, because if the natural law was the way it was, then why would we have evolved in the way we were according to the natural law? And I said, well, but then the Nazis would have been in the same case. The Nazis would have discovered the natural law, and it would have been in opposition to everything they thought was right.
The curious thing about this conversation, a couple of them. One is there is an appeal to natural law that's made by our founders, but they're speaking to the innate sense of morality, not some natural law in the sense that we're talking about it now, of the laws of God and nature's God, or something like that. They would use this language, I'm somewhat, until he used the word evolution there in his explanation, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the response, because on the one hand, for example, you were saying the atheist is saying, well, must be some natural law that explains these morals that we have. and then you say, what if you discover the natural law and it comes up with a different set of morality? Well, then that isn't the explanation for the morals that we have then. I think it would have been a fair thing for him to say. We're trying to find some kind of explanatory agent that will make sense of morality. But you see, this is the difficulty. You have to have an explanation that is adequate to the task.
Right.
That is, it's got to explain what it purports to explain. We know something about morality because we're operating it all the time. And I mentioned about obligation and those kinds of things. Well, then, and moral laws are not, they're not physical. They don't extend in faith. Moral obligations don't extend in space. They don't have physical qualities. So these are all things that need to be accounted for by a natural law. And I think just in principle, when you think of the nature of natural law, that's not the kind of thing that's going to give you the answer for what you're looking for. And especially since morality is chosen, there's a choice involved, and natural law, there are no choices involved with that. So it seems to be a specious kind of response. But first time I encountered it.
Well, my point, because you were saying that the atheist could say, well, if we discovered something and it was contrary to what we believe, then it's not the explanation for...
We're looking for.
But then that would have to entail that there's all different sorts of explanations for essentially every different type of moral belief. And if there's only one, and we're just assuming it coincides with our morals as opposed to the Nazis' morals, that was kind of my point. Is how do we know? Because the Nazis would have discovered it and said, "Oh, crap, this is contrary to everything we believe," and so we're just an accident of history.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is the implausibility of this kind of answer. It's actually kind of a category mistake. It's in natural law is a category of things that is not capable of producing something like a moral obligation by nature. And the way you know that is by reflecting on natural law, what we normally mean by the term, and moral obligation. When you reflect on those two things, you realize there's not any kinship between them at all. Kind of a rough illustration of this would be, you hear a big explosion, and you say, what caused that? And somebody says, well, I dropped a safety pin on the carpet. That's what caused that big noise. Well, no, it didn't, because that explanation is not adequate to make sense of the alleged effect. And the same thing here. I don't see how anything that we know might be a natural law can in any sense explain what we understand about morality. Anyway, it was a great conversation, Stellman, and you're a tough opponent as an atheist. You're working hard at things.
Trying.
So thanks for the shot.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time.
I'm just curious, do you have any other closing observations from where you sit about the way this conversation went?
I mean, I'm glad I did this with you, and this is why I wanted to do this with you, because this is one of those issues that I know the atheist kind of has a lot of resources to go to, and I didn't even get to all of the ones because you were really good at like stopping me in my tracks, because I was, like you said at the end, I was kind of trying to get all these kind of things in. Yeah, and I was expecting a lot. I don't know what I was expecting exactly, but I'm glad people got
this issue. There are two forms of the problem of evil. There's the deductive problem and there's the inductive problem. We focus more on the inductive problem, and that is there seems just to be too much evil in the world to be justified by a good God, okay? And that has its own strategy to deal with, and I was using that strategy. However, I think that it is one of the more effective pushbacks from the atheist. That is, it has more rhetorical force than other things. So that's one thing, just so people know, this is a very tough thing to deal with, I think, when you get pressured on it. And this is why it's important for me to make distinct the two worldviews in battle. If you're going to say we have too much according to our worldview, you get in our worldview, then it's certainly appropriate for me to say we have an omniscient God who knows what's best. So it's not impossible, and we have examples that we can think of how some evil would be explained by a greater good, and that's really all we need. But then if a person jumps outside of that and says, well, it doesn't seem like it's explained to me, well, then if they're in their worldview, then they have to make sense of the concept of evil to begin with in a materialistic, atheistic, naturalistic world. So these two things are going back and forth in discussion. One other thing I want to mention that I did that was important, and that is I did a thing called narrating the argument. And that is, at a couple of points, I would stop and I'll say, notice what you just did, Max. Notice how you said this to get some kind of rhetorical points. I'm just mentioning that. Doesn't bother me. Doesn't offend me, like you suggested, but I just want the rest of the people to see the move that was made. And I did the same thing in the middle a couple of times, kind of summing up where we've been going so people didn't get lost in the details. And then at the end, we only have a couple minutes to go, but I have a couple more complaints against Christianity. All right, if you want to do a hit and run, let's just let everybody knows this is a hit and run. It's your show. You can do what you want.
Yeah.
Draw attention to that.
Yeah, but no, everybody needs to get this book and pick it up, because it did just dawn on me what had happened. So I had all these kind of rejoinders, or these, what would you say, rebuttals to, written down for typical explanations apologists give to why God would allow such suffering. And I was anticipating you giving those reasons, and I was going to say, aha, but here's the objection. But you never really had to, because you kept it in a way of, well, I wasn't adequately providing evidence that would force you to give that kind of an explanation. Mm-hmm. And so you were pressing me on, well, hold on, before I give you any kind of explanation, make sense of what you just said.
I have a couple questions I want to ask you. And that's really the key here, the tactical approach. And they weren't abusive maneuvers.
Right.
In other words, I'm not trying to obfuscate. I'm not trying to confuse. I'm not trying to distract. I'm not trying to go off on a rabbit trail. I'm trying to come back to the main things using the questions that I was using to get clarification on what your view is so I don't misrepresent it, and to also get clarification on the reasons for your view or the grounding of it so that you could demonstrate that your objection is at least coherent. That was what I was after for the most part. And so people remember this. I asked, so you do believe in evil, right? Problem of evil. Yes. Okay. It's objective. Great. Moral realist. Got that. So what do you mean by evil? And you did what almost everybody does. You gave examples of it. And I said, I didn't ask you for examples. I gave what makes those things evil rather than other things evil. There's some standard you're using to measure by. And that's when you got into the human flourishing thing. So I'm just revisiting that so people can see, oh, that's what was actually going on there.